In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the brain and some of the structures within the central nervous system. So to start us off, let's talk about the central nervous system generally. Basically, the central nervous system is the area of our body where we interpret messages and we send out messages, again, to initiate particular action. So this could be anything to do with the body. Now, when we talk about the central nervous system, there are two main parts, and those parts are firstly the brain and secondly the spinal cord. The other part of our nervous system is the peripheral nervous system, and this consists of all of the nerves around the body that are outside of the brain and the spinal cord. So when we look at the brain, there are a number of key structures that we need to know. First of all, we're going to start with the cerebrum. Now, the cerebrum is this outer component of the brain. It's where we have a number of key lobes. So the first lobe that we're going to talk about is this frontal lobe here. We'll dive deep into the function of each of the lobes in a minute, but for now we're just going to be concerning ourselves with where they are. So frontal lobe, this is at the front of the brain. So this is our anterior perspective, or anterior side of the brain, and over on the right of my screen here, this is the posterior side of the brain. So after the frontal lobe, we then have the next lobe. I'm going to label them all in red here, and this next lobe is the parietal lobe. Following the parietal lobe towards the back of the brain, towards the posterior side, we have the occipital lobe. And I'm just going to make my marker a little bit thicker here so it's easier to see. But then we also have, towards the side of the brain here, this is what we know as the temporal lobe. So now that we've labelled all of the key lobes of the brain, we're going to label some of the other structures found within the brain. The first one is this structure here that I'm highlighting now in yellow. This structure is known as the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is a really important structure when it comes to posture, balance, and general fine motor control. So I'll label the cerebellum here. And this one often gets the name like the brain beneath the brain because, as I'll show you in the next image on the next slide, it does look a little bit like a mini brain sitting beneath the rest of the cerebrum. After we've looked at the cerebellum, we're going to look at the structure just to the left of that. Now, this structure makes up the brainstem, okay? And the brainstem is made up of a number of different things. So the first part of the brainstem is this swelling here, and this swelling is what we call the pons, okay? Just below the pons, and as indicated by number 9, this structure is known as the medulla oblongata. And following the medulla oblongata, this final section, section 11, and what I might do here is highlight this one in green, is that this green structure here, I'll switch to my green pen, is the spinal cord. So this is where the spinal cord connects to the brain via the brain stem, okay? And what I'll do is I'll get a really faint blue highlighter here, and we'll just highlight the pons, and then I'll also get a slightly different colour here, and we will highlight the medulla oblongata. As we then move back into the brain, there's only 3 more structures that we really need to know. So the first one, if I get another colour here, and what I'm highlighting in purple now, is what we call the corpus callosum. And this corpus callosum is a structure that connects the left and right side of the brain. Okay, corpus callosum. So after we've looked at the corpus callosum, just below this one, I'll get my orange highlighter out here, is labelled as structure 5. Structure 5 here is what we should know as the hypothalamus. Okay. And we know that the hypothalamus is connected via the infundibulum to an incredibly important pituitary organ, and that pituitary organ is, of course, or that endocrine organ, I should say, I've given it away already, is the pituitary gland. So let me just get a new colour here. Let's go with bright pink, this gland in here. So number 6, I'll switch to my purple pen again. Number 6 here is going to be the pituitary gland. And using that anterior and posterior that we wrote earlier, maybe I'll just highlight them in yellow. We can figure out which lobe is going to be which using that. So each of these are the core structures that you need to know this year. What we're going to do now is we're going to just dive into some of the other things within the brain, so these folds within the brain, and we'll also explore what each of these structures does. So if you want to pause now, take a screenshot of this, this is what you need to be able to label on the brain. But now, let's dive into the structures. So when we're talking about the brain, we can now see the cerebellum really, what I highlighted in yellow earlier, is this structure beneath the brain. But the main point that I really want to highlight here is all about these sulci. Okay, and I'll switch to my yellow pen here, I think it's going to be easiest. These sulci, okay, you can see them throughout the brain, okay, and their job is they are sort of these shallow downward folds in the brain tissue, okay, and these shallow downward folds, they really help us to increase the surface area. Now, we also have these things known as gyri, and these gyri instead are the actual ridges. So in between each sulci, if we're looking at the sulci as these sort of shallow ridges all around the brain, they don't extend in particularly deeply. These parts on top are known as the gyri, okay? Now, there is one other structure, and it's known as a fissure. And if I move down to my next diagram here, we're now looking from the bottom of the brain up, we can see that there's this longitudinal fissure. This fissure is a really deep downward fold. So our sulci were our really shallow downward folds in the brain tissue. However, the longitudinal fissure is quite a deep one, and that extends all the way through the brain here. Now, in this longitudinal fissure, this is where we get the separation between the left and the right brain. However, there is one structure that connects the two, and that was our corpus callosum. So if I just scroll back up here very quickly, we can see in purple, this corpus callosum is what connects those two lobes of the brain together, despite that longitudinal fissure. Now that we've got an idea of some of the larger structures in the brain, we're going to dive a little bit shallower, and we're going to have a look at some of the differences between white and grey matter. So you may have heard of white and grey matter before, but very simply, grey matter is that part of the central nervous system where the nerve cells and their nerve cell bodies are unmyelinated, okay? So they're really good for that sort of short-term response because they don't transmit information particularly quickly. When we're talking about the white matter, on the other hand, you can think of this as that myelin tissue. Why is it white? Well, the myelin tissue, as we know, is largely fatty tissue, and so that fatty tissue generally appears white, okay? And the benefit to all of the myelinated tissue is it is much quicker, so it can cover a greater distance in significantly less time. So in this instance, you can see letter A here is an unmyelinated axon, and B down the bottom is a myelinated axon, as we can see these Schwann cells, all three of them, forming that myelin sheath, Schwann cells. We can also see some nodes of Ranvier where that action potential is jumping between. So now that we've zoomed in a little bit and we've seen some of the smaller structures, let's back out again, and now let's talk more about the functions here. So we've already labelled our lobes on our diagram here, but if you really wanted to highlight and colour them in on your own brain diagram, here's a better image to show that. What I'm going to focus on though is the function of these particular structures. So I'll try and use the same colours that they have in the diagram. So the frontal lobe, I want you to think voluntary control of muscles, but more importantly, I want you to think things like memory, personality, emotions, judgment, okay? So while it is your voluntary control of your muscles, it's so much more than that, okay? It's really who you are as a person. The second lobe that we'll look at is the parietal lobe. Now, main thing for us is going to be, this is where we get our sense of touch, where we get taste and where we get pain. Okay. The temporal lobe, out towards the posterior portion of the skull and the cranium, is largely concerned with auditory interpretation. And finally, our occipital lobe, which is done in green here, is used for our vision and interpretation of data from the eyes. As we move down into the cerebrum, again, we've got these key words, so gyri, sulci, and fissures, and we've already mentioned so far that they are connected by the corpus callosum. Okay. So, As we move into the corpus callosum, as we've mentioned again, I'm sorry, I don't know what's happening to the top part of our slide here, but that doesn't matter too much. When we talk about the corpus callosum, its job is that it allows the two hemispheres of the cerebrum to communicate with one another. Okay. Now that the top part has jumped right back in again, the only really important thing that we're going to add to our knowledge of where the corpus callosum is located is that it's largely made up of this white matter, so these myelinated neurons. Our next structure is the cerebellum. Now, as I mentioned when we were talking about the cerebellum is involved in the smooth coordination of voluntary muscle movement, so that really fine motor control, and it's also really useful for our posture and for our balance. Okay. Now, the cerebellum itself is not under conscious control. It is under involuntary control, meaning that you're not actively thinking about your posture and your balance when the cerebellum is involved. It's just doing its thing in the background behind the scenes. As we then jump down to the hypothalamus, this is one that becomes incredibly important as we move into our third topic of homeostasis, because it controls a whole bunch of things that are really important to us. So it is involved in our regulation of our autonomic systems, which obviously is very important, but more for us, we're looking at body temperature, we're looking at our water intake and our thirst. We're looking at some of the responses involved in osmoregulation, so like contraction of the bladder. But because the hypothalamus itself is obviously involved in a number of endocrine actions as well, a number of emotional responses, okay, come from that coordination of the endocrine system. As we then jump down to the medulla oblongata, the medulla oblongata, again, is the area that is under unconscious or involuntary control. And the reason for this is it's controlling some really important things, and we don't want you to have to consciously think about them all the time, especially as you do things like sleep, where you can't consciously control your heartbeat, you can't consciously control your breathing, and, well, it'll do your absolute head in to have conscious control over the diameter of your blood vessels. So the medulla oblongata is one of those really important structures that we don't consciously use, but something that is really important with regulation and helping us to live. So we've spoken a little bit now about some of the structures of the brain, where they are and what they do, but what we're really going to be looking at now is how nerves can be used to connect these structures to different parts of the body. And when we're talking about the structures and the nerves involved in this, we're talking about things known as tracts. So tracts are effectively groups of myelinated nerve fibers, okay, or white matter, and they travel outside of the CNS, and we call them nerves, but in the CNS, and this is really important for us, so these tracts are found inside the CNS. They're basically groups of myelinated nerve fibers. So we've got three different types of tracts, and this is really composing them based on what they're connecting. Okay, so we have tracts in your cerebral cortex, and they are in the same hemisphere. We have tracts that connect the left and the right hemispheres, so through the corpus callosum. And we also have tracts that connect the cerebral cortex to other parts of the brain or other parts of the spinal cord. Okay. So let's move on down into our spinal cord now. So again, we're following these tracks, and the spinal cord extends all the way from the foramen magnum, which is a little hole in the base of your skull, and it extends all the way down to about your waist or your second lumbar vertebrae. Now, compared to the brain, okay, where the grey matter was in the centre and the white matter is around the outside, unlike the brain, in the spinal cord, the grey matter itself is in the centre, okay, and the white matter is around the outside. And so this is actually a flip of what is going on in the brain. So in the brain, we have our grey matter on the outside and our white matter on the inside. Now, when we talk about the function and the role of the spinal cord, well, number one, obviously to carry sensory and motor information, both to and from the central nervous system. But secondly, it's involved in these processes that we know as reflexes. Now, we will talk about reflexes in a few lessons' time, but for now, we're just going to brush over that. As we further travel into the spinal cord and we look at some of the other key components, something that's really important is this central canal. And you can somewhat see this central canal if I get my yellow highlighter and I colour it in on this diagram up the top here. The central canal runs the entire length of the spinal cord, okay? And it is what contains this fluid known as cerebrospinal fluid, which again, we'll talk about in a few lessons' time. Now, myelinated nerve fibres, okay, that we've spoken about, so these tracts, can be either ascending or descending. So ascending tracts are going to carry sensory impulses, so messages from receptors towards the brain, and descending tracts are going to carry impulses from the brain away, and they're going to be motor, so they're going to go to effectors, so things like muscles and glands. So all we're going to do now to wrap up this lesson on the brain and on the spinal cord and the central nervous system generally is we're going to label some of the key structures found on the spinal cord. So the one that I'm going to start with is down the bottom. It's the thing that we just highlighted that carries all of the cerebrospinal fluid, and that here is the central canal. Okay. I'm then going to jump back up to the top and we're going to highlight the grey and the white matter. So as we mentioned, the spinal cord, unlike the brain, has all of the grey matter inside the brain. And it then has all of the white matter towards the outside of the spinal cord. Now, as we look towards the right, you'll notice that we have this blue nerve running into the spinal cord itself. And this nerve has its cell body located outside of the spinal cord. Okay. Now, this nerve is actually on the dorsal side, so on towards the back, towards the posterior, and this is what we know as the dorsal root. It's the dorsal root of what we refer to as the spinal nerve. And we have lots of spinal nerves, and we've spoken about them. Now, this dorsal root, as we mentioned, has this swelling, okay, just before it reaches the spinal nerve. And this swelling is known as the dorsal root ganglion. The reason for this swelling, the reason that we have this dorsal root ganglion, is again that the sensory nerve cell body is located outside of the spinal cord. So sensory nerve cell body. Now that we've looked at the dorsal root, we can also see that there is a nerve, or there is an axon which is running out from the spine and then into the spinal nerve. And this runs out via what we call the ventral root. Okay, so we have the dorsal and ventral roots. Now, the ventral root, being a motor neuron, has a cell body, and we can see that the cell body for the motor nerve is located in the grey matter. So we're going to label it on the other side, but in this case we're going to label it as the motor nerve cell body. So this here wraps up the lesson on the brain, the spinal cord, and the central nervous system. Important things to note is A, being able to label these structures, know where they are, but secondly, and arguably more importantly, what all of these structures actually do.